But my name's James Gress. I work for Accenture. I've been with Accenture for 23 years. I've actually been in the IT business for about 3 decades now. Kind of shows with the hair. I'm not, at this point, I can't really hide it. I'm also a senior technology architect within Accenture, and just to give you guys some context of what that means, out of 750,000 people in Accenture, only about 800 are senior technology architects. So within the technology space, that means we really get to get our hands on code still, no matter how far we go up the organization, and we stay highly technical the whole time. I currently am doing a lot of work in the OCI, Oracle OCI, and Coher space. Has anybody heard of OCI or Coher? Okay, a couple people, that's great. Coher has been in the news. They're building LLMs for the enterprise and doing a lot of interesting things in that space. This talk is not going to be on necessarily that. I just wanted to give you some context of what I'm doing in this space currently. A lot of the references will actually be to things like ChatGPT or Azure, OpenAI, et cetera, just because it has a lot of commonality for most of the groups that we're talking with out there. And then my areas of interest, I'm the innovation lead for the advanced technology centers across North America. I have high interest in generative AI at the moment. There's just a lot of stuff going on in this space. And I come from a heavy DevOps background as well as a little bit of metaverse, and I still think metaverse has some legs. And as we start to dive into some of these things, I think it'll be a little bit slower road because generative AI seems to have kind of sucked the wind out of that at the moment. But it is coming, and I know we keep hearing about that, but just trust me, it'll be there. It might take a few years, though. All right, so Gen AI is the #1 driver of re-innovation today, right? So if you don't know, came across this on LinkedIn the other day. This is Julie Sweet, CEO of Accenture, one of the most powerful women in business today, you know, and well on board with that, meaning that generative AI is going to have a significant impact on just about everything that we do. Some interesting stats that Accenture did a survey on, and this was the percentage of executives who plan on investing more in Gen AI. So it's 99% of executives are saying they're going to start investing in AI. And then their top priority, 2 out of 3 of them said that is their top priority for 2024. So that's pretty impressive as far as organizations. I don't know of any other movement or technology that's come out where senior executives and executives have gotten those, got behind something that has come out in such a recent amount of time. But I think everybody can see some immediate benefits. So who's, I would say for 2023, there was a lot of experimentation, right? So a lot of people got into it. They started experimenting what it could do. Did a lot of prototypes. 2024, I really believe, will be a lot of situations where we're starting to like incorporate it into lower risk processes. Although I do feel that most of the stuff, at least some of the things that we're experimenting today, are really generating out some of the same processes or some of the same artifacts that we have generated out for a few decades. Some of the areas that we touched early on, it was around the software delivery lifecycle. So you can imagine, as Accenture delivers a lot of software for its clients, we looked at using generative AI for the software delivery lifecycle. But when we're looking at it, and then as well as a lot of our competition, as well as a lot of our clients, they're looking to generate things out like user stories, code. I'm sure some people in here have already started doing that. Tech designs, detailed designs, and things of that nature. And we'll cover a little bit of that as we go along. But I really think going forward, this technology has the ability to radically even change the processes that we know today. So instead of trying to go out and generate the same types of artifacts, I think that if we really start to look at it and really look at the technologies that are coming out, we're going to be able to start refining those processes and fundamentally change the way we do things in a lot of different areas across the business. So who here is already starting to use some form of generative AI in their day job? I'm hoping everybody. Good. So I don't really have to explain what Gen AI is. That's excellent. real quick before we move off to that, who's started to build generative AI apps? Couple? Excellent. So hopefully throughout this conversation, some of this stuff will resonate with you. And if you have any other challenges or any other insights into how you've been building software, I'd love to talk with you after, because I can only really cover so much stuff. But typically the barrier of entry up until recently, utilizing AIs, it's really required a lot of specialized skills and a lot of very highly paid specialized skills. A lot of data scientists. You had to be really a master of the domain that you were looking into, utilize AI. And it's really been regulated to the large tech giants out there, right? Up until about November 30th, 2022, right? So that's when ChatGPT went out there and announced ChatGPT, and this was a recent screenshot, but how can I help you today? Their form factor is actually pretty simple, right? All you have to do is go out there and just type in what you want. Right. And so you can imagine like the C-level executives or executives, a lot of businesses, as they start to go out here, they're starting to look at it going, oh my gosh, I can just ask it anything. It gives me all these like plans and documents. It helps me write emails, and it does such amazing things. And it's pretty simple form factor. I can even remember when this first came out, I talked to my kids and said, hey, this is amazing stuff. I'm in tech. I'm telling you, this is amazing. And they were like, I'm not impressed. All right. It wasn't until they figured out I could do their homework. Then they were very interested. And I would say that they now know it maybe even better than myself. And so I think this little poem is pretty accurate. And unfortunately, I really can't see it on my screen, so I'm going to have to turn a little bit here. But this one came out in 1988. The homework machine, homework machine, the most perfect contraption that has ever been seen. Just put your homework and then drop a dime. So let's just stop there, right? Summarize a book, summarize this essay, something, right? So you can almost imagine I'm just kind of giving it my homework, right? And then dropping a dime, that's kind of like tokens, right? It's about the cost of it, maybe 10 cents. And snap a switch in 10 seconds time, your homework comes out quick, as easy as can be. Here it is, 9 plus 4, and the answer is 3. And we call that a hallucination, right? So it was like very interesting that this came out so long ago compared to what it is today. But I think it highlights a pretty important fact that Gen AI really still needs a human in the loop, right? And when we look at and these numbers could vary depending on like your experiences, but I like to say it's like 5% effort for me to go in there and like create a bit of a prompt to get things going and tell it what I want to do. I usually give it a persona, context of what I'm doing, the ask, and any kind of format that I really want to push out there. But it's usually like about 5% of my effort. I'm expecting to get about 80% effort back from it. And then it's really up to me to make sure that last 15% to make sure it's really accurate. So in the case of like that poem, I need to make sure the answer is correct, right? Or depending on what's coming back, I need to make sure it's not hallucinating. Or I might need to make sure it's following my organizational standards. Whatever it happens to be, it still requires that human in the loop to get that last 15%. All right, so who here knows what the difference between theory and practice is? Joey?
In theory, nothing. In practice, there is difference.
Pretty close. In theory and practice are the same. In practice, they are not. And I'll be honest, I'm more on the practice side. So I'm not going to go into a lot of different theories. Most of the forward-looking stuff is already done in the presentation. But as you can see here, I actually build a collab space or a COE for the Oracle practice. And we do everything from ideation, prototyping. If things are successful in the prototyping phase, we take them all the way out to full-scale implementation. And the really cool thing is, even on the prototyping or even on the ideation phases, we're starting to produce value back to the business before it even goes into production. Now, I will say that, just as a disclaimer, we are not producing anything using generative AI for any client that hasn't expressed that we can do this. But for all those, that we have an agreements with, they're okay in the journey like we are, they're wanting to experiment, they're part of that 99% that are trying to get out there and do this stuff as well. We're starting to see those benefits even in the prototype phase. So if we're starting to prototype certain documents, like maybe on the tech delivery side, so tech designs, detail designs, we can actually do it in the prototyping phase and start to actually use those documents that are getting produced, which is pretty powerful. Because usually in prototype mode, you're not getting a lot of value out of it right away in the traditional sense. And I think that also leads to, in some cases, a little bit of an unrealistic expectation out of Gen AI. I think sometimes when we do these prototypes, they can last like 2 to 3 weeks and produce like some really fantastic results. But these prototypes are typically like done on a local user's machine, going and hitting a secure Azure OpenAI or Coher on the back end. And where it is all secure, it's not really out there for like large scale consumption. And when we start to talk about an application, it's just like any other custom application. When you go out there and put it out there in the real world, you have to do a whole bunch of other stuff. That's why there's a whole bunch of other stuff in that next couple of, as you go left in the cycle, making sure you have all the right security standards, et cetera. So getting things out to production, even though it's a bit faster, there's still a lot of work to do there. All right, so in most cases, I'm going to say that AI is not going to take your job. But the people that learn AI and can apply AI to their jobs will take your job, because they're just going to do it so much faster. They're going to be able to like utilize these LLMs or generative AI services to get that toil reduction at 80% in the middle, or some their number of. And those are going to be people that are like, as they start to become effective with it, they're the ones that are going to we're going to start looking at to do these types of jobs. Plus, the business is always going to want more. So I remember way back when we started learning .NET, and I was a software developer at the time. I know it's legacy stuff, but I remember I'm old. I remember thinking, oh my gosh, this is so much easier than C. They're not going to need software developers. Business people are just going to be able to go in here and do this stuff. And what ended up happening is, yeah, I could do a lot of more things with C# than I could with C, but the business just kept adding more and more requirements on top. So even though we're going into a phase where a lot of the LLMs and the generative AI is going to speed up development, it's just going to give us more capability to move the bar further. And at the end of the day, the business is just going to want to keep moving forward and wanting more out of us. So organizational challenges. Throughout the conference, there was already a lot of talk on making sure that you establish those responsible AI guidelines. It is very important. Some big challenges around the legal aspects of it. So organizations, on whether it's sharing data, they want to go through their legal processes and make sure all that's in line. And unfortunately, sometimes the legal teams still don't know exactly what some of these technologies can do or what they will do. So they're a little bit hesitant about allowing some of these services that go out there. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of great answers on there. As you remember, I'm more on the practice side. So I typically will do more of those types of things. So it does get a little complicated. And I apologize, the screen here is very dim in this outdoor lighting. But assembling the right team, I mean, that's incredibly important. I would say when we started, we couldn't find anybody that had a lot of experience, and it was so brand new. We had to train people up from the get-go. Right now, I would say, what we're really starting to look at is people that have already started dabbling in this already and starting applying it. As some of the qualifications. And there's some very distinct skills, either on the prototyping or delivering applications at scale. Depending on your organization, you're just going to want to start filtering those in. Bridging the AI business gap. So a lot of this is going to rely a lot on prompting, and it's going to rely on the business to understand what they're expecting out of it. Some of the things that I've already seen is we're kind of falling back into the old adage of I create a user story, I expect the developer to just understand instinctively what's going on and expect them to create these prompts without much intervention and, come to me only if you have a problem. The most effective ones is where we actually see the business working hand in hand with the prompt engineers, because it is such a rapid pace development, meaning like if you start to see the results and the business says that's not quite right, it needs a little bit of something else, they're right there to kind of help. The prompt engineers are right there to kind of help them guide what that actual prompt should be and what it should look like. And the development is actually pretty fast, but making sure that, we're talking to each other, right? And reducing those silos is very important. Selecting the right model. There's so many models out there to choose from. I'm going to say that whichever one your organization ends up going with, a lot of them are producing very great stuff, whether it's open source, if you're going on-prem, trying to do everything locally, or if you're trusting some of the cloud providers and their LLMs. As you start to select those, just select the model that's going to work right for you. And then what's great is you can utilize the prototyping process to actually figure that out pretty quickly without building a bunch of software around it. And then ensuring the longevity and scalability, and then of course, making sure that you have a data process in mind. The other big one is trust, okay? And I know there's a lot of confusion out there today. This one comes from Microsoft. I was just able to find it first. But if you look at it, some people get the confusion that Microsoft and ChatGPT are the same thing because they have OpenAI at the tail end of it. But if you read what's actually going on here, Microsoft is coming out here and basically saying, we are not training your data, or we're not using your data to train our stuff. Nor is it going to ChatGPT, because we own our own infrastructure and we have our own models. And so those are really important things. And I would also say at this point, if you're already in, like, say, Azure or OCI or Google or some of these other cloud providers, and they're offering up some of these services, and once you go out there and read their terms, they already have your databases, right? So they don't need a random prompt coming through the system every once in a while to try to like take your organizational data. They have access to your data if you put them up there in a database at some level, right? So I would say that trust level, if you trust them with your database, you can trust them with the terms and conditions that they're putting out there for your LLMs. All right, so a lot of the stuff we've done is around software delivery lifecycle. So a lot of my use cases are around that, but we have done a lot of other industry things, like being able to take unstructured data in the medical field off of forms and taking like an unstructured doctor's narrative and then be able to apply that information in that narrative to other areas within the form, et cetera. It's very good at doing that. And we still feel that there's still, at that level, a human in the loop. So already doctors, when they take these forms and medical narratives, they already have a review process. But it takes the reviewer quite a long time to actually process each of those records, right? By using generative AI, we can do things like highlight differences in fields, help show them other fields that were probably blank, but maybe in the doctor's narrative, and really help normalize and get the stuff ready to be able to be inputted into a database going more upstream. And it doesn't have to be like a doctor's form. It could be really any kind of form that comes in the system, being able to take that data and use generative AI to scrape the information off, using like an OCR service. But then if there's any kind of extra notes or anything like that, you can actually use generative AI to normalize some of that data. But like I said, a lot of the stuff is that I'll be talking about is around the software delivery lifecycle. So I think I've heard already a couple of people talking about GitHub Copilot, right? So from this group, how many people have already started using some sort of AI-assisted coding? Excellent. So a good number of people. We've actually looked at this for a number of years, but I will say the one that I like the best right now is GitHub Copilot. And I've kind of heard the rumors, and a lot of people are like, yeah, it just doesn't quite give me the code completion that I was expecting, et cetera. And I would say you're right. If we're just looking at like trying to do the code completion at the end of every line, it's okay. I mean, it will help. You have to kind of keep typing to actually get what you want, et cetera. I would say if you haven't tried the chat capability is a game changer. Now, I promise you, I don't get any money from GitHub on this. I'm just sold on it. I actually have to pay my own license. But if you're using the chat capability, it's basically like putting the power of the GPT-4 right in your IDE, so you're not even having to leave the context window. You're able to ask it things about your code. Just this year, they released stuff where you can like do at workspace, and it's going to actually search the files that aren't even open, where before it had to be an open tab. Now they have the ability to go and look for things in your non-open tab. It will like help you complete auto commits, etc. And I really can't spend a ton of time on it. But if you really kind of look at the features and what they're doing, they are adding new things every day, and it's becoming a very powerful tool. But it does have some limitations. And the limitations I can still see is like when you're talking about enterprise type scenario, talking about things in the software delivery lifecycle, there's quite a lot of other areas that it's just not going to have enough context because it just doesn't have access to all the right data. And it's not really going to help you do all these things necessarily at an enterprise level. Some of these things it will do for an individual level if you want to help like Copilot to write a user story, etc. I've done that a number of times. But if you really want to do it a little bit more consistently, you want to do it at organizational standards within your organization, you're going to have to like build something else to get there. Where most people actually start is they want to do a prompt library. And so this is where they're starting to go into ChatGPT. They're starting to do different things. And this happens to be an interesting use case where I'm notoriously bad about writing user stories. But when ChatGPT came out, or I should say when we got a service to Azure OpenAI, I was able to go out and help actually start utilizing some of this to create my user stories for me. And now I had to give it enough context for it to write appropriate ones, but it was really good. And when I was working with the Agile folks, they were like, no, you shouldn't use any tool to help you create a user story. That should be all like between you and the business. And I was like, okay, how about I write a user story assessor and say, hey, here's my user story. I just want you to assess it using the Invest framework. Then they got excited about it, which was kind of interesting. And then what you can see here is like basically a prompt to like assess a user story. And the user story is actually really bad because it's like one line and it really shouldn't have been graded as high as it was. But you can actually see it gave it a 5 out of 10, which is another thing that we've been seeing even more lately is whenever you ask any of these systems to kind of grade an output of any kind, it tends to favor on the polite side. So it's almost like it doesn't want to like tell you it's bad, right? So you kind of have to judge it. Like it's very rare that I would ever get a 1 out of it. But if you understand like what's going on behind the scenes, you could probably use that a little bit to your advantage. And then as you start to get into the different prompts, there are hundreds of prompting styles. This is just a handful. But like single shot, multi-shot, chain of thought, there's just, it seems like they're coming out with new ones every single day. But it is a little bit difficult to start navigating all these different things and really expecting people to really understand like how to use these, especially the normal business user. So some of the shortcomings are non-deterministic outcomes from LLMs, right? So it's going to start generating out different kinds of data, and then as well as organizational detail. And as you can see, some of my images here are generated by DALL-E, which I have to say I generated a whole nother set of images for this talk, because when I did this talk 6 months ago, I just really never cared for them, but seems like I got better images this time, so I think I'm getting just a little bit better at it. What's really important, though, is understanding the organizational details. So if you're going to start building something and you want that type of output, you're going to have to do something more than just some of those prompting styles. You're actually going to have to use fine-tuning and or retrieval augmentation. Or another option is you could build your own. This is one of the newest NVIDIA chips. I think they run about $30,000, and you need lots of them. So building your own especially a very, very large language model, like some of the ones out there today are probably a little bit cost prohibitive. Then you also have fine tuning. So fine tuning, you can basically take a pre-trained model, give it some of your context data, and then have it trained, and it'll actually start to adjust some of the weights or adjust some of the layers within the model itself so that you can actually incorporate some of your data. I still don't recommend this because one of the side effects is you could have catastrophic forgetting. So not even just hallucination, but catastrophic forgetting within the model itself. And then since you don't really have all the other tests to understand, like if you are starting to run into that problem, it could be very difficult to detect. So a real safe method is using retrieval augmentation generation, or throughout the rest of this talk, I'll just talk about it as being RAG. And essentially, it's giving you the ability to take some kind of data that you take from your system and feed it into the LLM real time. Now, this was an interesting one I saw on LinkedIn the other day, and I went to go back to look for it to make sure I gave credit, but Thomas Edison here, vision without execution is a hallucination. Well, in our case, LLMs without RAG is a hallucination. And one could actually argue that everything out of a LLM is kind of a hallucination because it has no idea the difference between what's real and what's not real. It's all prediction on words. But that's for a whole nother debate at a whole nother time. So a real simple RAG type situation is I have some kind of app orchestrator that's sitting in the middle, and at the very top, I have some way of retrieving my organizational data or my organizational standards or something that I'm going to expect to get out of the system. And then I'm going to feed the prompt plus my organizational data at real time to be able to produce an answer. So I'm going to ask a question, and I'm going to say basically, here's your source of truth. Don't answer things outside my source of truth. And it's going to be able to come back and give you a relevant answer. These things work really great in prototypes because I have a very limited amount of data and I have a very targeted prompt. So as you start to work through this or start to put maybe 5 or 6 documents in your system, you're going to come back and go, my gosh, this was easy. I should do more of this. But I can tell you, as you do more of it, it gets more complicated. And so at the end of the day, just as another aspect of it, when we're saying we're uploading our data, we're not really uploading a document per se, right? So one of the things we have to actually do is get embeddings. And getting embeddings can be pretty tricky. Usually when people get into this, this area, they're just setting a PDF in, letting, one of my architects likes to call it naive embeddings, where it just like breaks it up by page, grabs embeddings by page, throws that up back up into either a semantic search or a vector database, and we go from there. The problem is if you have pages of context that, like, if I have a topic that's spanning across 3 pages, when I go to retrieve that information, I'm not necessarily going to get all 3 pages, and it's really important that I get the context of the entire answer. Because if I send bad answers, or if I create embeddings that are incomplete, I'll potentially get bad answers as a result of my RAG system. So there's things like chunking size, overlaps, techniques that you can do. You'll have to figure some of those out from an organization level, or what types of documents you're putting in to figure out how to create some of those embeddings. Being able to get embeddings out of images, so being able to send like the images you're getting out of your documents, sending them up to an embedding service that's going to describe what that image is, because you might want to actually grab those types of images. One of the use cases that we had from some of our senior leadership was, hey, I have to scan through a whole bunch of these documents looking for that one image that describes something. How can I do that, right? So we started to explore, like, how do we actually describe those images effectively so we can pull those things back. Things like table of contents you might not even want in your system, because a table of contents is not really going to tell the LLM how to necessarily act. There's probably some edge cases there, but for the vast majority of the table of contents you probably don't want, as well as tables, right? So information in tables, they usually have a lot of metadata around them that you want to be able to strip off. The LLM needs to understand from an embedding perspective how to make use of that information, and then making sure you're not cutting tables off like you'd be cutting off some of the rest of your embeddings. And then you also have situations of documents that you might have maybe different version releases. So if you have software that's like version 1 and here's your setup instructions, or software that went to version 2 and here's your other setup instructions for that, and they're similar but different, you don't want to send in the wrong documents if someone's asking, like, how do I install something? because now you're going to have a situation where your retriever in this situation could come back with the wrong document or a lot of documents with conflicting information. And on that, I'm going to say that your data is likely not as good as you think it is. One of the other use cases that we did was around ticket resolution. Anybody here work on any kind of systems or know teams that have ticket systems that people actually have to type in a resolution to finish the ticket off, right? And so I know for a fact that for the folks that raise their hand, the resolutions are nicely detailed. Everything's like buttoned up. I appreciate that. Hopefully that'll come across on the mic. But what we're finding is like most resolutions are closed ticket. Oh, look at this email, fixed. Customer's still having an error, decided to close it anyways. So as we start to look at like how do we start to deflect tickets within these ticket resolutions, going back and looking at the old resolutions might not be like something we can really rely on. And one might think like, okay, so that's not a good use case. Well, being in the generative AI, COE, and trying to create solutions for customers, I said, well, hold on a second. I could just take the rest of the ticket detail and derive a resolution. And that actually worked about half the time, which was kind of interesting because in some of those situations, we actually kept the emails that went back and forth within the system, and we could actually pull some of that information out. And based on some of the other information, we could actually start deriving what the resolution should be, which then got us to thinking, well, wait a minute, as people close tickets, we could actually prompt a resolution for better data quality going forward, right? So as a person closes closes one of these tickets, we can actually say, here's what we think the resolution was, please confirm. And I'll tell you that most people will probably be more willing to say, no, that wasn't quite it, and kind of adjust a little bit rather than try to come up with a whole resolution on their own, which was another thing that GitHub Copilot was doing is started, like if you go to do a commit, it actually gives you a prompt or it gives you a little button you can click for a automatic prompt or automatic code commit completion. So at least the developers will start doing that a little bit. So ways to help on the data retrieval side. I can't go through all the methods that we've been using just because I just don't have enough time. But one of the really powerful ones is doing re-ranking. And as you can see there, if you look across the top, you have like all the data in your corpus or all the data in your corpus of knowledge. And if you had like tens of thousands of documents, you could see that as I go out to try to retrieve things, getting the right type of data coming back is it can be incredibly difficult. And you can see there the little yellow boxes that actually, when it comes back from the vector database, right underneath the database itself, it's basically saying the yellow ones are the relevant chunks of data, and you can kind of see they're kind of mixed across the whole thing. We really just want to take, like, say, the top 3, the top 4, et cetera, within the system to be able to feed those in. Because if you remember, if we pull back bad embeddings, we can throw our models off. And so we really need to determine what those embeddings are and then how to pass in the right ones. And there's a number of services that are really nice to be able to do this. The other one is generally when you're trying to do retrievers utilizing these embeddings, they'll come back with a score. Another methodology is to like make sure that you have a high enough score threshold before moving that embedding into the prompt. So if it has a pretty low threshold, kind of leave those out. But using a lot of these techniques will help you refine that. One thing that we started looking at just today, and this one's really interesting, it's coming out with some really interesting results, is multi-query transformation. So as a user asks a question, we actually use LLM to derive similar questions in that same family. And in parallel, we go after all those embeddings. And then as we get that information back, we re-rank, reorder, and then collate that back to an answer. And so we're looking at the metrics there to try to understand, like, is this a possible methodology? But I will say that our initial findings are pretty promising. Data governance as a whole is going to be very difficult. I already kind of mentioned that we're starting to store like tens of thousands of documents. What happens if I pull back an embedding? And I will say that within our system, one thing that I do or the team does is we give the thought process, what embeddings were used, the citations, as well as we actually list out the prompt, right? So that as we start to explore and understand like why responses might not be that good, we can actually go back and start looking at these things. And one nice thing is if we look at it, we can look at those embeddings and go, wait a minute, this embedding really isn't good embedding for this particular question. And then we need to go and remove that somehow. And having a good data governance process is going to be critical because you're going to have tens of thousands of documents. The actual documents are going to be living typically in another spot compared to where your embeddings are. And if you have multiple embeddings for the same types of documents, you're going to have some kind of mechanism to be able to remove those, understand what they are, how to get them updated, and how to prune things, etc. Some of the tools that are out there today kind of move this to the end user to help kind of self-regulate and self-prune, which is kind of interesting. But making sure you have all that down is going to be incredibly important. So as you can see, RAG can sometimes not be so simple, okay? I'm not going to digest this whole, or explain this whole thing to you. I came across this that came out of, I think, Llama Index off LinkedIn. So you can go check it out. But it actually covers a lot of the things that we talked about today. But you can start to utilize each of these methodologies to help improve your data. Another thing is being able to go out there, or what we're seeing a lot of people doing is starting to use knowledge graphs. If anybody know what a knowledge graph is? Okay, a handful. It's basically a different way of representing the data from entities and known relationships, and it knows how to kind of go traverse and get the right data without going into probably a lot of math and like a lot of examples. It's probably a little bit longer of a topic than we have today. But that's where we do see a lot of people moving to. So if you're out there looking and you see this knowledge graph stuff, check it out. All right, the data trap. I had to get a Star Wars thing in here. So if you happen to remember, it's a trap. Admiral Akbar, I think it is. And so as you start to look at your RAG systems and you're starting to produce these things, there's also things out there like output parsers. So if I'm going to start asking questions of my LLM and I really want a very formatted response. So if I'm doing like in this case that I'll be showing is test cases, right? And test cases generally are going to go into a spreadsheet at some point in time. So we want them to be very prescriptive on how they generate their output. And then we also need to upload a bunch of data as well to be able to produce the test cases that we're expecting from our organizational standards. So as you start to do all that stuff and as you start to generate those output, there's going to be occasions where your end users are going to go, I just went out to ChatGPT, gave it a prompt this long, and I got a better result. And maybe it is a better result. Maybe it's not, because usually the folks that are looking at this, and a lot of the feedback we get is they just like the look of what it looked like. They didn't actually necessarily take it all the way and say, hey, I want you to actually try this. They looked at it and went, wow, I really like those expected results. Or I really like the way those preconditions looked, etc. So one of the things we did was we started implementing a little bit of a blind or a double blind testing. So in this case, what we're doing is we're giving a direct LLM answer, and we're also giving a retrieval-augmented answer. And we switch the left and right panels, although we do keep track of it internally. So you can't just always pick the left one, or you can't always pick the right one to be able to get that answer. But now we're going to start looking at that information and say, hey, if they do start picking truly the LLM version, is there something bad with our data, or how can we improve our data? Or what metrics really should we do? So it's a way of kind of back tracing and understanding, like, are we utilizing this technology as best we can? And in that particular example, after you select a particular test case, we give the users the ability to start modifying those test cases. So the panel on the right side is an open text area. I can ask questions about it on the right. I can do different things with it if I need to adjust the test case or add more to the test case, etc. And I would also say, be prepared for ever-changing things within your environment. All right, so if you start really putting generative AI into your systems. You're going to have evolving models. You're going to have retirement of models. We've already had models retire on us, kind of right in the middle of things. I gave an example here of some of the ones that have already been retired, and I would say adaptability is key. Also, changing behavior. And this is just 2 examples I came up with just yesterday on just changing behavior that's happened over the last week for me. And we see this even using the APIs. So within their systems, they're moderating out content and doing things like, I'm not going to give you images of famous people, or I'm not going to give you text if it looks like this. There's even been occasions where I've been in demos trying to demo something, and I had a kind of a routine, and I usually got an answer, and all of a sudden it basically started really like giving me a whole different answer than I got before, and nothing changed in our code. So watch out for those changing behaviors. And then LLMs, oh boy. Really we'll start to think how we think about code. As we look at what LLMs are capable of doing, and as we start to like apply DevOps principles, it actually becomes a bit difficult because when you look at it, the prompt itself is starting to become code. So how do you code quality that? There's not like a Sonar cube for prompts, right? Or how do you test or put a testing framework on something where before you had a definitive answer and you can say like, I expect this out of my prompt. And if I'm ever going to get if I'm going to constantly get different answers, but on the same theme, how do I test for that? I can't just say, oh, if I got text, I'm good. I have to actually look at the quality of that prompt that comes through. Also, and I'm going to go through a couple of these really quickly because I'm out of time. From a model development perspective, when should you use 3.5? When should you use 4? I would say, in general, try to use the lower level models for simpler things. They're faster, they're more targeted. Things like summarization, 3.5 does fine with, categorization, etc. Leave GPT-4 for the more complex types of things. Plus, it costs a little bit more, and from a responsiveness from your application, you should be looking at that. And then I would also say, usually when I'm asking ChatGPT things, I'll say please. Usually in code, I usually don't do that. Like if it's a prompt in code, I typically don't do it. I will say, and it's probably because when I'm chatting with it, I'm a little bit afraid that Skynet's going to come around, and I just at least want them to think he was at least polite when he was in the early days. But I was chatting with a colleague out in Australia, and I didn't get to the agent frameworks, but they're actually putting out like moderators, polite moderators within an agent or within their stuff, and they're finding they're getting better results if you ask some of these models very polite things. I don't have any anecdotal evidence of that. It's just something that has kind of come across. So I would say use it as your own, but it's kind of an interesting development that's starting to come around. And I would say definitely now is a good time to get into AI. Joey talked a little bit about that. We are just in its infancy, so we're like little baby robots doing all this stuff. So I'd definitely say getting into it. I briefly did talk about it, but if you are starting to look at agents and how to do agents, this is a really fun one. I would never say like use this one in production, but it's really something fun to play with. But this is a whole software delivery team, from the CTO to designers to coders to the document writers, and all you really have to do is tell it like, I want a tic-tac-toe game or a Pong or Flappy Bird, and you can watch the prompts go from agent to agent, starting to build these different things out. And it has a replay mode, and you can actually go back and read a whole bunch of this stuff. It's really kind of cool stuff. And I am out of time, but I would also just end with, as you start to develop code in this space, the things that you're building today might get simplified greatly tomorrow. Meaning like that whole retrieval augmentation infrastructure, it could be an API call like in 6 months. All right. And then hopefully, now that you've seen all this, this is the He-Man reference. I have the power for some of us that happen to remember that. And that's all I have for delivering generative AI solutions in the enterprise today.